Well, I wish Alfred Hitchcock had done Lovecraft, because if you look at Vertigo, you'll see what I'm talking about. The whole mood of Vertigo is one of surreal suspense. You don't know whether this woman is a ghost or reincarnation of the same woman, and it's a very spooky film. I mean, he puts an aura of darkness over that film that no other director, to my knowledge, has ever achieved. That's why Vertigo is such a classic, in my opinion.
Do you think there's a surreal element to Lovecraft then?
Oh, yeah.
Or an extra real?
Oh, yeah. Another dimension, and that's what films can't reach. They can't reach that dimension. And that's why Lovecraft comes across as corny.
This film is literal.
On film. He comes across as corny rather than scary.
Well, you can do non-linear, you know what I mean? And that's one way to achieve it.
But those films are inherently non-commercial. Hollywood will never back.
Oh, I'm fine with non-commercial.
Well,
There has to be a commercial element, but I mean, you know, for people who are going to see it, but there's a big audience for films that are not commercial. You know what I mean?
No, there isn't. That's why they're
They're all
not commercial.
No, but I mean that's why Del Toro's Mountains of Madness isn't. No, it's not struggling. It's not being made. It hasn't been made for 10 years. It won't be made because it costs $150 million up front and another $300 million to market it.
Yeah.
And if it was your $500 million, you go, damn, that's a lot. Let's make sure the kids who are 13 to 17 can go see it, because that's the key demographic for seeing motion pictures.
But the blockbusters like Alien, that was also an art movie.
But that was then, and this is now, and it was not $150 million. It was not that kind of mega budget movie.
It didn't cost that much back then.
No. But even adjusted for inflation, it wasn't a mega budget movie. It was, and that's what made it successful. It was a relatively low budget that has an incredibly high yield.
I think they put a lot of that dollar on the screen too, to be honest.
Yeah.
When you look at the production value, I mean, it's like right there.
Oh, yeah. It's beautiful.
That's one thing about Whisper is you can see a lot of the production values on the screen. So.
Or lack of it.
It didn't go into craft services, I can tell you that.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of overhead on it. There are ways to get around that, but yeah, that in particular is I think, difficult one to film, especially because of locale consideration. That's why I think Carpenter actually came closest to it in a way with the thing.
And I was going to go
That's
off
not
the
that
bill.
you're talking about.
No.
Go
I was going to
ahead.
go off the bill with saying I agree with your point, Bill, because I think a good example of that would be In and Out the Madness by Carpenter. And they gave him a huge budget. And they put the film out. And they're like, this is going to do well. And instead, it bombed. The reason why it bombed is so many people went into that going, what the fuck was that?
No.
Where at the end of the film, I was like, fuck, I'm in that seat. So I totally agree. And I do think that John Carpenter has done a good example of the thing and In and Out the Madness.
In the Mouth of Madness is very uneven.
But I think that the surrealism in that film is so Lovecraftian. And by the end of the film, you still don't know if Sam O'Neill was written, if he is a character, or if he is a person. You don't know.
What about, I think a film that's been recent that's very Lovecraftian is actually Cloverfield. There's a lot of things about it, big monsterism, but also, I think it's interesting. The reason I think it's interesting is because the big monster thing, if you get away from that, from the Godzilla angle, because a lot of people approach it from that point of view, is if you start looking at levels of remove and things like this, these literary devices that are actually inherent in the script, it's kind of interesting to see how they took this idea, because I think Hollywood is struggling with how to embrace this notion of Lovecraftian cinema, but they can't quite get their tentacles around it. So what is your feeling about that?
Well, Cloverfield?
You want to take the first bite?
First of all, I don't think Hollywood is struggling with how to do Lovecraftianism in film. I don't think Hollywood cares about Lovecraftianism period. However, that said, Cloverfield to me is nothing but a disaster.
That's true too.
It is.
Earthquake, sudden adventure, whatever.
It just in that particular movie, the disaster happens to be a monster apparently from outer space, but it's inconsequential. It could be any generic disaster. That movie is about 20-somethings in New York running for their lives and looking pretty while they scream. That's what that
No,
movie is.
turn the video camera off.
What about
You want them to die?
Absolutely. I'm just so happy. Yes, they just want to die fast.
what if we made them 90-year-olds who drank a lot of coffee?
It still would have probably been.
It still would have been a disaster.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I don't see Cloverfield as a Lovecraftian film.
I do. I definitely see an impulse in that. Now, it doesn't mean it's successful necessarily, but I think there's a streak to that, and they tried to review it.
I think J.J. Abrams went to cash in on the
Well,
pop culture side
of
of
course he
Lovecraft, but I don't think it comes in on screen at all, and I wouldn't call it a Lovecraftian film.
I think Frank Darabont wants The Mist.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I thought that
No,
was.
that I think-
Yeah,
And the
and-
story itself was very
Yeah,
Lovecraftian. you know?
no, and the execution of it in the film.
And he did a great job of changing the ending that King originally wrote. Even King himself was like, oh, I should have done that. And then seriously, when I went to the premiere of that film, once you hit the end of that film, nobody said anything in their seats. Everybody just sat there. And then I clapped, and everybody clapped. But still, once the movie was over, everybody just sat in their seat. And that, you know you have an impact when nobody has left their seat yet. They've sat through the credits, and they're still trying to take in or soak in everything that just happened. Because it was so fucked up and surreal. And that, to me, is Lovecraft.
How do you feel about like Reanimator, for example?
It's fine. Actually, I saw it.
It's not a
years
strict
ago.
adaptation.
Yeah, I think actually it's quite successful at what it intended to do. I think Stewart told that movie pretty well. I don't think it's really Lovecraftian at all either, in title only. But for that kind of movie, if you're going to go for a gross out zombie gore festy kind of thing, okay, it's a pretty good one. But I think Lovecraft would be just scratching his head and seeing his name on the poster.
There's a lot of impulses in Lovecraft's fiction that people forget when they're talking about Lovecraft. I mean, he wrote, if you look at Cool Air and the music of Eric Zahn and all the Greenland stories and all this stuff, he didn't just do the things that fall under the mythos banner. And actually, for me, Herbert West Reanimator was a ludicrous pulp cartoon parody.
But I think he also thought that.
He was tongue in cheek.
Oh, yeah.
So if you're going to do this movie now, the tongue, different tongue, different cheek. It's totally, I
They were
felt
telling you were vagina.
But From Beyond was much more in, now we're dealing with the Lovecraftian.
It was much more serious in
recognize
tone, too.
It's other dimensions, it's creatures from another dimension, and that seems more Lovecraftian to us, even though I think Lovecraft embraced a much larger tradition of supernatural story, and you see a lot of that in movies that you don't think of as Lovecraft.
Well, I do think Reanimator helped popularize Lovecraft in cinema more recently. You know what I mean? Obviously,
Obviously,
Lovecraft is
Lovecraft
like
like
National
National Lampoon on every poster. You Lovecraft.
Right.
Cthulhu's on South Park.
Yeah, I think that did help, and I think that's kind of double-edged. I think that, you can have serious things, then you can have bastardized things, a la Cloverfield or whatever, because they can have just the merest hint of something, and it could be kind of lumped in, whereas before it was like totally an unknown commodity, untapped resource, so to speak. Now, do you think that there's a long life for that, or do you think people are going to have to get farther away from the stories, or like the literal adaptations for people to start buying into them, or they're going to have to become more and more escalated violence and/or it keeps people's interest?
I was going to bring up the Sandy Peterson issue earlier because, like saying, Lovecraft totally survives among a huge group of people who have never read a word of his fiction through the games.
Right.
And a lot of times, I deal with a lot of gamers who know that I'm in Lovecraft and go, I've played a lot of Call of Duty games and stuff. What should I read of his? I'm like, well, first of all, there's a bunch of stuff in those games that's not out of Lovecraft. If you've got an introduction to it, you might just find you can't wrap your head around the prose. It's not going to be like a fully kind of experience, but that particularly has led a huge number of people to know who Lovecraft is. And Hellboy, there's a bunch of things that people recognize as Lovecraftian who've never actually read a word of Lovecraft. They just go, oh, that's that Lovecraftian stuff, because I know that.
What do you think makes it Lovecraftian?
Well, in those cases, I think it's the
Tentacles.
And then,
That's true.
And then the particular Necronomicon, there's things like
Necronomicon, Muscatonic.
You got Necronomicon,
Unspeakable, unpronounceable.
tentacles. There's historical monsters that look like they're sort of out of antiquarian research. Those things kind of have a Lovecraftian buzz, a pop Lovecraft. But that's what it takes to percolate through the culture is in every form. So we can talk about Lovecraft
Is
based
that
on
net
textual
good, is that net
analysis.
good or bad?
Well, I just find it interesting that he's so ubiquitous among different groups who've never encountered him except through other forums.
This was an interesting phenomenon we saw through our distributor, because we have, our film, which we call Cthulhu, and it's out in video on demand space. So it's on Hulu and Netflix and iTunes and these different spaces, and we get reports back that tell us, how many people are downloading or whatever. And after the Cthulhu episode of South Park, we see this enormous time-driven spike of downloads of it on Hulu. The interesting thing Hulu does is they put in essentially chapter markers in the movie so they can measure the metrics of not only how many times people see the movie, but how much of it did they watch. And so you suddenly get 10,000 people are watching our movie the day after it appears on South Park, and only watching the first chapter going, what the hell is this? This is not South Park, and I don't get it, it's silent, and change it, and get out. Yeah, absolutely. So, and I'm fine with that, because again, we're not the droids they're looking for. So they need their South Park fix or whatever.
Well, I kind of find Into Madness, it leaves me real cold,
The story?
The book, excuse me, the movie,
Oh, and the Mathematics, sorry.
And it's kind of, I'm just like, it doesn't do anything for me. Whereas Reanimator, even though it's not really, it's kind of a comedic romp in a way, that outrageous, over the top, ridiculous thing. And I find it more engaging, it makes me more interested in Lovecraft, stories and other movies. Whereas Into Madness kind of makes me go, Carpenter not at his best. I think in a way, like The Fog is a better kind of Lovecraftian take, even though it's more of not a mythos type story, but more of a Lovecraftian horror take.
What about Dagon, where he kind of took a more serious
Well, that's
approach?
Gordon, right? But the thing is with Dagon, I thought it was, see, I knew Gordon, so I don't want to give him that. But, I think that Dagon, I like the movie, but I think the effects kind of held it back a little bit and didn't work for me because there was some CGI in there. Not the Uncanny Valley aspect, but more like this is just not realistic enough for me, to kind of buy into the
There's a
creature.
very opposite Uncanny Valley with Lovecraft, where you're no longer comparing to things you see, but comparing to what you
Imagine, yes.
that he deliberately described in, ambiguous terms.
Right.
It's very hard to, no one will ever be happy with what they actually picture.
I think that's true, and I think if you like his work, you kind of try not to do that, you try to be judicial with films, because of the way you envision it, and Whisper may not be the way I did it, or Marc, Joshi, you did. It's just, and so you try to go, well, it's their take, or even if it's very well written, done, as far as literal interpretation or not. I think you have to be mindful of that everybody's picadillos are going to be different. But I think that it's just flatly directed. It's part of my problem with Into Madness, for example. And Dagon, I think, has a compelling, I think some of the acting I was bothered by. A little bit of the acting in The Resurrected I was bothered by. We're going to be seeing the ancestor. And once I get past the actor and just accept, now Chris Sarandon is fantastic. Okay, he's very menacing and horrifying and totally out there, as Charles Ward, where he's like, I must have meat, sir, and all this kind of stuff. He's kind of chewing the scenery a little bit, but it required that. It injected a certain amount of intensity to the role. And that just was missing for me with Sam Neill in Into Madness, and also, I think it was Combs, right, in Dagon. Who was the main
No, it's not so cool.
He looks like Jeffrey.
He does.
But anyway, the lead there, I wasn't connecting with him. And that can take you a lot out of the movie. You can't mean that, in your film, actually, I was able to connect with the dragons, but that's not always the case, even for well-known. And especially, I find it with a well-known actor. I sometimes just cannot connect with them, because I know, that's probably your film. That's whatever. So I'd rather have it in another cast. So, getting back to the topic. Best adaptations. What do you think are some of the worst?
I'm going to check one thing. There's the aura. The idea of the aura. How much of it's the suspense. Lovecraft does this thing where he gets you built up. What am I going to see? What am I going to know? And Hollywood is really good about doing this in a promotional manner, not
That's true.
necessarily in the film itself. But one of the best Lovecraftian moments that I ever had what I expect to see from a movie. In the early 80s, there was a huge promotional thing where I opened the paper and it was a 2-page spread that showed it looked to me like an Antarctic plateau. It was just this white flat peaks in the distance, and it said Francis Ford Coppola presents, and that was it. It's this 2-page spread, and then the next, and I'm like, oh my God, they did the Mountains of Madness. I can't believe it. And I was excited about that for like 24 hours, and then the next day came Never Cry Wolf. And I was like, for a day, I could picture the movie that was going to happen, and that sense of anticipation is the hardest thing to meet. I think we all have that in relation with whatever your relationship is with Lovecraft stuff. It's about the inexplicable and the unseen. These things. It's really hard to expect a movie to actually. I'm going to ground this for you personally in a way that is specifically what you want.
It can be done, though. It can be done very hard, very hard. I think maybe a handful of movies ever in cinema have done that kind of thing, where you really have, this is the ultimate take on that. Even the Hollywood's going to rape and pillage it and remake it. So, what do you think about when they remake Whisper of Darkness? They're probably planning it now. It's going to be expensive.
I'd say it's their $150 million. They'll spend it how they want. That's their deal, not mine. So.
What if they remake Reanimators? Well, that'll be interesting when they start getting to this level of remaking film. Reanimator, Megan, Ancestor, Alien, when's that going to happen?
As soon as we quit going to see them, they'll quit making them.
That's true.
That's really the problem. And if you don't like reality TV, quit watching it. Because that's what drives it, is the eyeballs that are seeing it. We're the problem, not them.
Yeah, because they're following the money. I guess.
Yeah, absolutely.
No, that's all Hollywood cares about. They don't care about Lovecraft or any of us or R or anything else. They just want the buck. If they can make a buck out of something, then they'll do a good job. Good films get made accidentally. They're not made with the intention of making a good film. The intention is to make a money-making film. That's the only thing that they care about. Then out of that comes a good film. I want to mention one film that I think is certainly not Lovecraftian, but it has the aura that I'm talking about. That's Picnic at Hanging Rock. I don't know whether you've seen that, but the aura in that movie is so disturbing. You're disturbed almost from the moment it starts, and you don't really know why, which is a great way to be disturbed. Because you can't put your finger on why you're nervous. It makes you very nervous, that movie. These women go around the rock and disappear, as I recall. I don't really know the details, but I knew that the aura of that film was terrific. And that's what we need for Lovecraft. We need a superb cameraman, a superb director, and a superb script. And put all those three together, and you'll have Lovecraft. And, well, it's not easy, obviously. Can be done, and maybe it will be done someday. Maybe we'll actually make money and have a good Lovecraft film. That would be nice.
What do you think?
I think that Lovecraft is too hard to touch right now in Hollywood. I think that, like you guys said, it's all about the money. So why do you think you want to touch that?
Keep moving away. Keep turning this way.
Yeah. So no, I think that Hollywood, I don't see it happening. I don't see it happening, so.
Look at them.
All right,
I'm
yeah.
a moderator, that's why I'm looking at them, because I'm just trying to see their weight. So, all right, we'll turn it over to questions now. Unless there are any other final commentary here. No? Yeah.
If faithful Lovecraft adaptations are a hard sell in Hollywood, what about television?
Probably a harder sell.
What about television?
Make a series of Lovecraft shorts over the course of a season on HBO. You guys proved you could do it at a low budget, far lower than HBO would probably.
Yeah, actually HBO and Showtime are two probably the best possible
HBO, yeah.
vehicles for something like that. And they did that Boardwalk Empire.
Carnival and Boardwalk Empire, both. I mean, they're
Showtime is too much a woman's version of everything. They go for the women's the soap opera version, but yeah, HBO could do a good series of Lovecraft short stories. Do Cool Air, do A Rats in the Walls, do little separate stories before they tackle any shadows over animals or anything like that. Do the short stuff.
But it's still, it's a very difficult sell to convince them they should do that instead of the next, Rome or Breaking Bad or whatever, high-end, series that they're going to do. But if anybody's going to do it, it's not going to be the networks. It will be